Hello and welcome. This is Tom for GTO Wizard, and today we're going to dive into the 2+2 scene and analyze some of our very own Wizards hand histories. Stay tuned. We asked 2+2 to send us the most interesting hand histories to be analyzed in a GTO Wizard video, and today we're going to do just that. This first hand comes to us from New Guy here, who's battling it out in the 50 NL streets. Let's dive right in. So our hero, New Guy here, is sitting in the big blind with ace deuce off. Small blind opens it up to 3 bigs and he makes the call. Ace 8-7 rainbow, flop checks through. King of clubs on the turn and small blind overbets. New Guy here is not phased, he makes the call. Brick river, small blind puts in another large bet and New Guy calls it down correctly. Villain shows the missed double gut shot bluff. And New Guy scoops the pot. So what do you guys think of this call down? Was it close? Was it good? Was it a clear snap call? And were there any reads involved? Well, let's dive into the analysis and take a look. So the first thing I like to do when analyzing a hand is start with the aggregate reports. These reports contain information from all possible flops. And the reason I like to start here is because these reports give me great heuristics that I can generalize in game. For example, we see that small blind rarely uses one of these larger sizes, typically starting out with a check or a small bet. Small blind should play defensively here and not overextend right on the flop, otherwise their wide range is going to be very hard to defend on later streets. When they do check, big blind typically sizes up. They are using 66% as the preferred size, as well as checking back a decent percentage, mixing in overbets and smaller bets. This is because generally you have position and small blind has capped themselves to some degree after they've checked one street. So we can even go back and apply some filters just to see how this applies in game. For example, we can just broadly apply, I don't know, ace high with some middling cards. And let's say it's not monotone, not paired. As you can see, the small blind strategy typically prefers a smaller bet or a check here, very few larger bets. The middling cards are going to hit big blind's range better. And the ace high on board decreases the value of fold equity with your top pair. So generally speaking, these types of textures prefer a smaller bet or a check. Once they do check, back on big blind, typically going to prefer an overbet targeting the middle of their range, those capped hands. So let's take a look at the actual strategies on this board. Here we can see that most of the strong top pair in small blind's range will bet, for example, just going by hand strength. More ace-king than ace-9 as an example. There is some 2-pair plus, but this is such a small portion of the range. And in fact, let me navigate over to the ranges tab just to demonstrate this. So this tab lets us compare both ranges at the same time. And you could say, sure, small blind has more ace-ace, but realistically, the 2-pair plus is proportionally about the same for both players. In fact, if we take a look at the equity graph, although small blind has a range advantage due to their top pair, they do not have that nut advantage near the top here. And that's because everyone has all the 2-pair here. And when small blind checks, well, it gets a little worse for them. So in this spot, ace-2 suited can make a fine small bet, but you have to ask yourself what your range wants to do, and in general, your range wants to play an overbet strategy here. Ace-2 does not fit into an overbetting strategy. It's you'd be overplaying your hand, you'd be overextending. So this hand much prefers a check back when the rest of your value is overbetting. With that said, New Guy recognizes this, checks back, and we take a king of clubs turn. So the King X is a pretty good card for small blind, and that's because they should have a whole lot of second pair in range, right? These King X hands are less incentivized to bet the flop, therefore they should be here in the checking line. They also provide support for small blind's middling hands. For example, all of these middling pocket pairs, 7x, 8x, such that your stronger hands, ace-king through ace-9, 2-pair and such, can go into a more aggressive line without compromising the strength of your checking range. And we can see that report here in the turn reports. I'm just going to sort by cards. In general, these Broadway cards will provide enough support to your middling range such that you can start developing some aggressive overbetting strategies. Some bricks are also overbet, but the range does not bet as frequently at all. In fact, I can even change this over to default and sort by cards. And let's just check the expected value of different turn cards for small blind and big blind. Small blind is on the top. In general, these Broadway cards are going to hit their range much better, whereas the middling and lower cards generally hit big blind's range better. So as we can see, overbet is the preferred strategy here. And how is it constructed? Well, you've got a few trap sets, plenty of 2-pair and top pair, and of course a ton of natural bluff candidates, gut shots, open-enders, flush draws, and such. So when I asked New Guy about this hand, he told me that he thought the small blind overbet was overbluffed. And to arrive at that logic, you'd have to think, how many natural value combos are there? How many natural bluffs are there? Well, there's a ton of natural bluffs, right? So many of these gut shots, club draws, open-enders, really just a ton of natural bluffs. But how much value is there? Well, ask yourself how often you think small blind is checking the flop with a hand like ace-king or a 2-pair hand. Because if they don't have these hands in range, then all they're left with is the natural bluffs or like an overplayed weak ace-x middling type hand. So given this read, New Guy figured that this turn overbet line was overbluffed and planned to call it down on most runouts. Now, obviously, top pair, easy call on the turn. You should call all your top pair. If you start folding this, you're folding too wide and you can just get blasted off your equity by bluffs. You become exploitable. Even second pair should be calling this overbet, particularly second pair that does not block the natural bluff candidates. For example, King 2 doesn't block any of those gut shots or open-enders, whereas King 10 does and will therefore have less equity. Of course, he makes an easy call and we'll take a river. So the 3 of hearts is better for the small blind's range, and that's mostly because a lot of their value, such as their medium strength top pair, can keep firing on this runout. And if we take a look at the ranges tab here and just check the equity distribution, this blue line, that's small blind's range, is quite polarized, meaning they have very strong hands and very weak hands. This is because they've overbet the turn. Whereas big blind's range is more condensed towards medium hands. They have lots of bluff catchers. So facing this bet, you have to ask yourself, what's a good call? And we can see that a lot of 2-pair, second pair, third pair, even low pair, all exist on this long flat green line, indicating they're all very close to indifferent. We take a look at the strategy. It is mixing in calls with all of these hand classes. I think a lot of beginners would just do something linear, like continue with top pair plus and fold the rest, because, why would you call a king facing this line? Or why would you call, anything weak facing this line? But you have to ask yourself what your opponent is bluffing with and what they're value betting. This line is representing very strong value. Let's just take a look at what this is supposed to represent for value. We have sets, 2-pair, and only the very strongest top pair in this line for value. And of course, a ton of bricked draws. So you have to then ask yourself, which hands in between their bluffs and their value are a bluff catcher? Of course, that's going to be all of these. And which of these block value and block bluffs? Well, let's just take a look at the top pair, for example, and switch over to strategy plus EV. Ace 2 does not block bluffs. Ace 10, on the other hand, does block bluffs, right? For example, they're missed Jack 10 or 10-9 or Queen 10. So Ace 2 is going to be a higher EV call in this situation against a balanced opponent. Now, if your opponent is imbalanced, then perhaps all of these are going to be good calls because they're all going to have the correct pot odds. In fact, even many of your weaker hands, which seem like natural folds, will become easy calls if your opponent is overbluffing even slightly if they don't have enough value. New Guy recognizes this, makes the call, and correctly scoops the pot and gets shown the bluff. Really nice hand. Thank you for the submission, New Guy here. Okay, let's move on to the next hand. This next hand comes to us courtesy of PJJ, who's battling it out in the 25-L streets. Now it folds to him in the small blind with ace 3 off, and we'll notice that they're quite deep. 265 big blinds effective. He opens it up, big blind makes the call, and we get a connected two-tone 6-7-8 board. The flop once again checks through, jack of clubs on the river, and he goes for a 2/3 pot bet. Okay. Big blind calls, the 2 of diamonds river completes the flush, and he puts in a block bet. Interesting. Big blind makes a large raise, and PJJ 3 bets representing the nut flush with his ace of diamonds blocker. Big blind lays it down and he scoops the pot. So what do you guys think of this hand? Was this line justified? And what do we think about the 3-bet on the river? Cool line. Let's dive into the analysis and take a look. So our hero PJJ opens it up in the small blind with ace-3 off. However, he is playing very deep stacked, about 260 bigs deep. And as we go deeper, well, ace-3 off actually becomes a pure fold. However, it is a 0 EV open. It is indifferent between opening and folding. Same with ace-4 off. Same with many hands in the small blind range, to be honest. So you can't really fault the guy for opening this hand. We can use something like ace-4 off as a conduit in the meantime. Generally speaking, as you get deeper, you want to shift away from these hands, these offsuit hands that just try and make a top pair, and move towards more suited stuff, more connected stuff, something that can draw to something strong, realize its equity well, and has good implied odds deep stack. So he opens it up, big blind calls, and we'll take a flop. So this is a horrendous flop for small blinds range. As you can see, they're practically range checking despite being the pre-flop aggressive. And you should ask, why is this? Well, to answer that question, let's go into the ranges tab. I like to start with this equity distribution. As you can see, they don't really have a nut or a range advantage at all, despite the fact that they have all the overpairs in range. It's just not enough to compensate for how bad this board is. Let's just full screen this for a second. And here I've selected EQR, that's equity realization for both players. Equity realization is a measurement of performance. It's the expected value of your hand compared to your pot share. And so, for example, if we just take a look at ace-8, this hand has 62.3% equity realization. That means it's going to claim only about 60% as much as it would if the pot were checked down. So it's going to drastically underperform, as is most of your range. In general, the positional advantage goes up as stacks get deeper, and so it is the power of your draws. So big blind having position and more of these middling cards is generally going to favor their range. For that reason, small blind should check a lot so as not to put themselves into a bad position on later streets. PJJ recognizes that this is a bad board for his range, and he checks. Actions on big blind, and in general they should be using a lot of small to medium sizes here, preferring the 66% size with a lot of their overpairs, 2 pairs sets, straights, and of course an abundance of draws. They check it back and we'll take a turn card. So on the turn, the Jack of Clubs is a fantastic card for your range. That's because it's going to hit a lot of these top-heavy cards that you have more of. We can see that the range advantage has improved significantly, so has the equity realization, and small blind is now ahead in all metrics, EV, equity, and realization. From the equity distribution graph, we can see they've developed a nice range and nut advantage, which is going to allow them to lead aggressively. The strategy here is to check about 44%, mixing in small bets, mostly medium bets, and even some overbets as well. These medium bets are going to be constructed a few straights, sets, 2 pair, overpair, but mostly going to be a lot of top pair for value. And we can see in the filters tab that most of these made hands are going to be doing betting, right? You're only going to be checking about 20% of the time with top pair plus on such a dynamic board, especially when you have enough nutted hands to develop an aggressive attack here. From the reports tab, here I'm just going to group by cards, and I've selected the expected value. We can see that these larger cards, 9s through ace, tend to benefit the small blinds range, whereas the lower cards generally benefit the big blinds range, which should make sense as we're the pre-flop aggressor. So PJJ leads out with ace-4, and the next question is this a good hand to lead with? Well, sorry, he has ace-3, but we'll use ace-4 as a conduit. Generally, stuff with a diamond is what you want to be betting with here when you have ace-high, and if we just filter for leading diamond combos and ace-high and even king-high, you can see that these are going to be betting quite aggressively as you block the diamonds, which means you're going to get more folds. It also means you can represent a flush on later streets, and your outs are cleaner, meaning you can hit top pair without also completing villain's flush draws. So PJJ recognizes this is a decent card for his range. He likes his diamond blocker. He goes for the 2/3 size. And villain facing this size should be doing a little bit of raising, but mostly going to be just calling here. We can see what the thresholds are. It's important to identify, what can you be folding here? Well, you shouldn't be folding 8x at this point. This is too early in a BVB situation. The threshold is going to be some third pair and lower pairs as well. Something interesting that you might notice with the low pair is that it's folding a lot of the ace-x, ace-6 and king-6, but it's calling some of the lower stuff. And that's just because these hands, first of all, block fewer bluffs, and second of all, have more draw potential. So big blind makes the call, and we'll take a river. So we get the 2 of diamonds on the river, and here's where the fun starts. So PJJ opts for a block bet in this spot, which seems decent. We can see that the block bet is going to be mainly constructed using top pair, mixing in some stronger hands and some bluffs. The solver also constructs a overbetting strategy, primarily composed of straights and flushes and a few sets, and a 75% strategy with sets and overpairs. The block bet does seem good. If we take a look at ace-4 here, we can see that this hand in particular prefers a larger bet, typically the overbet or the medium-sized bet. And that's mostly because you don't want to put too many pure bluffs into a block bet line. You typically want to use very few bluffs, mostly medium hands, and then just a few traps. However, it can fit into this line. It's not a problem. He goes for this block bet size. Actions on villain. And as you can see, facing a block bet, villain should be raising quite aggressively. I'll just group these together. And we can see that they should be raising a good 21% of their range, mainly using flushes, straights, 2 pairs, and such. And we can see that basically all of their top pair, under pairs, second pairs should mostly be calling, but almost all of their 2 pair plus should be raising. So villain raises it up. Actions back on us. And the solver here is going to, again, 3-bet using flushes for value. I'll just separate those. And a mix of sizes. And of course, anything with a diamond blocker in particular can make an okay raise, right? Ace-10, for example, is an okay raise. Even ace-5 is indifferent between raising and folding, and that's just because you block the nuts. The real problem is how many of these you put into your range. It's very easy to get out of line with way too many ace of diamond combos and just be completely over bluffing. Then again, perhaps that's not a bad strategy against the right villain type. And after this hand, we're going to talk about some of the exploitative adjustments that he described in game. So facing this size, he goes for this 85% 3-bet strategy with the nut blocker. As you can see, big blind should be shoving here with a decent chunk of strong flushes, as well as some nut flush blockers. A lot of these ace-x hands, for example, with the diamond blocker. In the end, big blind folds, and our hero PJJ takes it down with a brave 3-bet on the river. Nicely played. So let's discuss some of the interesting adaptations and exploits he made in game and compare that to the strategy. So the first adjustment he made was pre-flop. Now, obviously, he opened a hand that isn't technically an open, but he's informed me that, according to his research, the 25NL pool does not raise nearly enough facing this open. Big blind should be raising something like 17 to 20% of their range in this spot. But if they're not raising enough, then all of a sudden, a lot of these indifferent hands or these close decisions become a pure open, simply because you're going to be able to realize your equity. On the flop, he did say that he sensed this was probably a range check spot, although he wasn't quite sure. And he had expressed to me that villain had some history, and he knows this guy likes to stab quite often. So he was quite surprised to see this check back on the flop, and therefore on the turn expected villain's range to be quite capped. So the turn bet is somewhat exploitative in that he thinks villain is not going to be checking back enough of these strong holdings, right? Sets, straights, 2 pairs, over pairs. A lot of these strong holdings, he just expects villain to bet, which would therefore increase the EV of bluffing with ace 4. And that's certainly a fine assumption if you think villain has capped themselves, and if so, you can even size up, right? You could even go for an overbet line, given that they won't have enough nutted hands to counter that strategy. On the river, he expressed that he thought villain's range would be quite capped and almost any bet would be profitable here, and he said he wanted to split his strategy between a small and a large size. He said that the smaller bet might overperform because he thinks villain will overfold to it relative to the sizing, which makes sense from an MDF perspective, if you assume they're capped. Facing the raise, he decided that he was going to 3-bet any ace of diamonds because he didn't think villain would call with the appropriate range. And if we see what villain is supposed to be calling this 3-bet with, well, we can take a quick look. He is actually indifferent with a bunch of hands, even some top pairs, 2 pairs, sets, straights. A lot of hands have to mix in calls in order to reach the minimum defense frequency. And if they're not finding those, raise calls, it's going to be quite difficult to defend properly. Of course, one caveat is that if villain is, raising too value heavy, then of course this line isn't as good. But holding the nut flush blocker does reduce a lot of his strongest flushes in range. So overall, I like his play and I like these exploitative adjustments. And I think you played it pretty well. Thank you so much for the submission, PJJ. Nice hand and very brave 3-bet on the river for the win. All right, that's it for the video, guys. We hope you enjoyed this content. If you'd like to see more like it, some more user-submitted hand history analysis, let us know. I'd be happy to do it again. If you want to discuss the theory, please join our Discord, link in the description. We love to chat theory there. That's all for now. Happy grinding.